Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Turner, and I am the Engagement and Support Coordinator for Event Atlantic. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar today on behalf of our friends at TIPI and Events Nova Scotia and ACOA today, who were really behind the research that is being presented today by MQO. So I will now pass it on to Lianne Sarson. She is the VP of Research and Engagement at MQO Research, and she will be doing the presentation today. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thanks for having us here. I'm really excited to go through some of the findings of the research that we've been doing for the last a while now, since back in September. So we have some fun tidbits to go through today. But just to give you a little background on us, MQO Research is the research arm of Group M, which is a marketing communications company. And we have, you can see the 5 companies there. Full in-house services from marketing to production, research, as well as public affairs. But to get to today's topic, to make sure we have time for some questions and discussions, the goal of what we're trying to do here today is really to share some insights on the current state of the supply chain, as well as give everyone an update on where event goers' intentions are, where people's heads are at. There's been a lot of changes and restrictions are lifting. We've had Omicron come into play. So we just wanted to kind of check back in with event goers and see what the current state of the industry is right now and where we're headed into the summer and spring and the rest of 2022. So hopefully some of the insights that we'll be able to share today will be useful for planning and help us go into that busy recovery period as we're moving out of dealing with COVID more as a pandemic and hopefully moving to seeing it as an endemic and something that we live with. So again, not that anyone needs to be reminded of this, but COVID-19 obviously has put a very significant strain on businesses, in particular, those businesses around the festival and events industry. So what the importance of assessing the health chain is really critical, essentially, to make sure that we can support the recovery of the industry as we move back into a place where restrictions are lifted and people are getting back to events. So the question we really wanted to answer going into this is, will the impact of COVID-19 on the supply chain have an impact on festivals and events as they recover in Atlantic Canada? And if so, what can we do about that? So I won't spend a ton of time in the background, but we really approached this from a couple of different directions. We talked to suppliers. We did a survey online to be able to get some input that way. We also did some in-depth interviews to really try and get an understanding of where there might be differences among different businesses. We also checked back in with consumers, as I mentioned. One piece, obviously, is understanding what the current state of the supply chain is and whether or not those resources are going to be there as festivals and events get moving again. But the other piece is, what's the demand going to be? Is there going to be a high demand as we move into 2022 with the changes that we see? So those two pieces together are really how we've approached getting that understanding of where we are right now and where we're going to be as we move into the rest of 2022 and beyond. But one thing that we know as we've gone through the past few years is context is really important. As we've checked in with event goers and where businesses are at, it's really changed moment to moment as we go through the pandemic, depending on whether there are outbreaks, what restrictions are in place, where we are in the pandemic in terms of fatigue. So understanding the context of when the data was collected and what's going on right now is really important. So I just wanted to spend a second to kind of put some markers around that to say that where we are right now and the data that we're talking about today reflects the situation that we're in that Canadians, including children, have had the opportunity to be fully vaccinated and in most cases boosted. We have a very, very high vaccination rate in Atlantic Canada, as well as in some of the markets we typically draw from, like Quebec and Ontario. Quarantine restrictions and regulations are being lifted across Canada, but COVID is not gone. There are still fairly high case numbers, hospitalizations, and while it's not as front and center in the media, it's still there. Festivals and events are put in a position now where mandates are lifted, so individual decisions need to be made event to event, business to business, around whether or not they're going to continue to implement any health and safety measures and what those safety measures should be, again, if at all. And that's going to depend somewhat on the individual situation, where your customers are at. So hopefully some of the insights today will help planning and some of those decisions around if you do want to continue health and safety measures and which ones might be most important. Atlantic Canadians and Atlantic Canadian businesses have been dealing with the pandemic, the ups and downs of it, and trying to navigate these challenges for the past 2 years now. And we're ready for a return. So that's just to put a little bit of context around it. And we're going to start with where people's mindsets are. So the first thing that we're going to go over is what some of the findings were from the survey. This is a very, very recent survey. So we just did this in mid-March. So it's very current in that restrictions, as we were doing this, announcements have been made to lift restrictions. So it's very reflective of now. And what we found is that event goers are ready to get back to festivals and events despite continued concern. So the concern is not gone. It is considerably lower than what we were seeing earlier in the pandemic, when we were seeing rates of 89%, 90%. If you've taken part in any of these in the past, you may have remembered those numbers and me commenting on how high it was, the percentage of the population that was very concerned over COVID. We're now down to a place where there's still about 50% of event goers, and that's an important distinction as well. We are only the data that I'm sharing with you today is only those individuals who are folks that go out to events and that take part either in sporting, cultural events, music festivals, and those types of things. And there's still about close to 50% of those people are anxious about COVID around events in the summer and fall of 2022, but 77% of them are going to go anyway. And that's an even higher in 77% of Atlantic Canadians. That's even higher in Quebec. So we found 84% of Quebec and Ontario event goers are going to attend events in the summer and fall regardless of their anxiety levels. So even though people are still a little concerned about COVID, it's still there in the back of their minds. They're ready to get back to festivals and events. So we did break down a little bit by event to event to see if there were any differences. In particular, earlier before vaccines and things, we saw kind of stark differences between the types of events that people were interested in going to, in particular if those were outdoors or indoors and things like that. And we're seeing pretty high across the board with, you can see here again, Quebec and Ontario being quite a bit higher, with the exception of a slight difference, although it wouldn't be significant, in concerts or live music. Quebec and Ontario, again, is a little more enthused about going to the particular types of event, but it's pretty high and consistent across the board, from arts and culture through to food and drink festivals and music. We did dig into a little bit on why those people who said that they weren't going to attend events in the summer and fall weren't going to go. And again, this was a pretty small percentage of people that decided that they weren't going to attend events of event goers that would typically be doing these types of things. And they tended to be a little bit different for Atlantic Canada and Quebec and Ontario, where Quebec and Ontario is still pretty concerned about both catching and spreading. Atlantic Canada is a little more split between catching COVID and then the combination of catching and spreading. And one interesting thing that we found is there is a chunk of folks that don't feel comfortable in crowds anymore. So after 2 years of this reduced capacities, trying to stay home, not really having the option for large events in a consistent way, people feel, and you may have experienced this the first time you started to go back out into crowds, a little uneasy about being in large crowds. So that is something that we saw in about 27% of Atlantic Canadian respondents, and a smaller amount, 19% in Quebec and Ontario, which isn't surprising given Quebec and Ontario may be more, event goers may be more likely to be in larger crowds more consistently than Atlantic Canadians. So getting into the health and safety stuff. So we thought that this understanding maybe what would make folks more or less likely to attend a festival and event is what we wanted, how we wanted to tackle things, rather than asking like we did earlier in the pandemic, what level of comfort, things like cleaning, access to outdoor spaces, vaccination of staff and things brought people. We wanted to understand whether or not how much it was going to impact people's comfort, but whether it was going to impact their likelihood of attending an event. And the reason behind this is that we did see that fairly high percentage of people who are anxious but are still going to go to these things. And so we found that the two largest are having a full refund cancellation policy and frequent cleaning and sanitization. So those are two things that people really still want to see. The concern, or what the pandemic with all of the rolling lockdowns really brought into view was this concern that people didn't want to, or were hesitant to invest in things and were waiting to the last minute to invest in things in case there were going to be lockdowns. And that may still be true to a point with people's fear of catching, in particular Omicron, with the sense that it is still very infectious. And even though it may not be serious, many people may end up catching it. There may be a concern that an event that they might purchase a ticket for, they may not be able to attend. And so having that full refund cancellation policy is still very important, and something that is going to make people, at least 67% of people, more likely to attend an event if that's in place. And again, cleaning and sanitation is something that the majority of folks see. In the other top 5, we have outdoor spaces only, so that's still providing a level of comfort. And fully vaccinated staff working at an event and fully masked staff working an event, we're at around the 50% mark. And so of folks that would be more likely to attend. Somewhere closer to the bottom, we asked about a long list of different types of health and safety measures. You'll see there, again, bringing fully masked staff working at the event about 52%. I wanted to bring that down into this slide just to highlight that the requirement to wear a face mask inside was also around 50%. I'm going to talk about face masks again a little bit later. But down close to the bottom, where you have less than half of event goers more likely to attend an event if measures are in place, we have negative COVID tests for staff working, rapid tests for attendees, contactless payment options, and self-certification. So that would be, for example, the questions that you typically get asked throughout the pandemic if you were to go to a dentist or doctor. Have you had a fever? Have you had COVID? That kind of thing. So it's just self-reporting. And down at the bottom, we've got no requirement to wear face masks, so the ability to go without face masks, no vaccination requirements, social distancing requirements gone, no one-way foot flow traffic, buffets, indoor spaces only, and large crowds. So those are things that had that people were less concerned about. Less than a quarter of folks would be more likely to attend an event if those things were not in place. So the other thing we tacked on, although this isn't related to managing sort of anxiety around COVID or the decisions to whether or not to extend any health and safety measures beyond mandates, we wanted to take a look at some of the technologies that have been in place that supplemented some of the health and safety measures as people tried to find new ways to adjust to the mandates throughout the past few years. So a lot of these are focused around technology. And what we wanted to understand here is, for those businesses that are making the decision on what they should continue forward, how much value is really added to the experience by these particular things? And so what we heard back was the ability to buy tickets online, assigned seating and tables was an addition that folks really enjoyed throughout the pandemic. Contactless payment on site, those were the top 3 that people felt really added value. Being able to do digital check-ins or have tickets on your phone, online, mobile, and friendly guides, and being able to pre-purchase items like parking are also pretty up there. So we also saw that, over half of the folks found that wearable technology for cashless purchases adds quite a bit of value. Mobile app details with specials and prepaid smart cards. But again, when you get down past that sort of high 60%, then you're weighing whether or not an investment is worth the additional value. But the top ones, in terms of being able to maintain the ability to buy tickets online, assigned seating, and contactless payment, as well as digital check-ins, are definitely things that people want to see continued. So we also wanted to see, so what we've been asking about a lot as we go through the pandemic because of rolling lockdowns is what the intention is to return to events and how interested people are in participating in festivals and events in the future. And where we're at a place now where restrictions are lifted and people have the ability, events are coming back, we wanted to see, of the people we sampled, how many people are holding tickets right now for things. And we found that at the time that we did the survey, which again was mid-March, 33% of Atlantic Canadians currently held tickets to attend a festival or events, and 47% for Quebec and Ontario. So again, you're seeing that higher appetite in the Quebec and Ontario market based on who's holding tickets right now. The average ticket price we found was $159. And again, we don't have information in this particular survey to suss out what type of event those might be, but we just wanted to throw out where people were at in terms of the average ticket price, because we wanted to get a sense of whether or not, after people were thinking about the price they paid, whether or not they felt that the price was what they expected to pay. So one thing that we heard was costs are going up for supplies, and so as a result, decisions need to be made about whether or not prices are going to be increased around tickets and things like that for festivals and events. And the majority of people felt with the tickets that they bought were about what they expected to pay. There was 21% who indicated that they paid a little more than they expected. So that was just a brief rundown on where event goers' heads are at. Essentially, people are ready to get back to events. As things roll out, we've got a slightly higher interest and intention in Quebec and Ontario than Atlantic Canada, but the appetite is strong for events going forward, even with that level of anxiety that is still there around COVID. And I'm going to go back to that a little bit when we go through the kind of key takeaways. But the next thing I wanted to talk about was what the supply chain end of things looks like. So what's the health of the supply chain? Now that we know that people want to get back, that people are going to be coming back in full force, is the industry ready to handle that? So there were 6 things that we assessed in the supply chain here, and these might not be what we would have necessarily looked at maybe 3 years ago, or maybe even into the future what we would look at, but we really came at this from a recovery lens and considered the unique challenges and stressors that the pandemic has put on businesses. So we looked at revenue losses, we looked at increasing costs, we looked at diversification. So for example, whether or not to survive, businesses had to shift the focus of their business. So if you were a rental company, where you're not supplying tents and things to weddings and events and things, are you now supplying them to pop-up testing sites? And are you still going to be able to reroute those back to festivals and events? Some people had to unload certain things to be able to manage and get through the last 2 years. So what does that look like going forward? We looked at availability of labor. We looked at capacity, reported capacity to be able to supply small, medium, and large events. And we looked at supply chain resiliency. And what we meant by supply chain resiliency was looking at essentially the scars for the past 2 years. So what does the industry look like now in terms of who's managed to pull through and what the current state is now? So the first thing that we talked about was revenue loss, and there was 86% of suppliers experienced a significant decrease in profits from the beginning of the pandemic to fall of 2021 when we conducted the survey. 56% was the average reported decline in profit. So it was obviously a very significant strain on businesses. And in addition to the loss of that revenue, as businesses go back into a more active stage as we come out of the pandemic and move towards recovery, that loss of revenue is still going to have a significant impact going forward because of things like dormant equipment or new technology requirements that are going to be needed, upfront costs to get businesses back and running essentially, as well as there's still a need for the consideration of additional risk management for companies in planning and executing events, and additional costs that come with the decisions to move on, to continue on health and safety measures if you choose to do that. Without those mandates, would government supports exist? So the loss of revenue over the past 2 years has really removed a little bit of a buffer that businesses would have to be able to manage some of those things. In addition, there was an increase of costs for inputs driven by the pandemic. So that's going to drive up product and service costs for the events industry. It was about 3/4 of event suppliers that we surveyed indicated that the pandemic would likely result in an increased cost of their products over the next 2 years. So about 44% of folks that we surveyed expected an increase of between 5 and 10%. In terms of diversification, as I mentioned, 68% indicated that they did have to take these sort of diversification measures to help their revenue through the pandemic. So they pivoted services into other sectors. And we found this a lot in the key informant interviews as well. There were a variety of sort of subsectors of the festivals and events supply chain that really found creative ways to make this pivot in order to survive. And you can see the effects of that when we get to the resiliency of the businesses and of the supply chain in Atlantic Canada. So availability of labor was one of the things that we found was one of the more significant concerns, and it did vary subsector to subsector, but staffing was certainly a concern for suppliers as well as event owners. So there's definitely an opportunity there in terms of talking to folks what their number one concern was going forward. Labor was definitely up there. 60% of festival and event suppliers had to reduce staff during the pandemic. Many of these folks moved on to other industries or found other lines of work, and may not be easy to come back to staff up as demand increases. The other thing is a loss of skilled labor. So in particular, for example, audio and visual technicians in Atlantic Canada, again, having to reduce staffing throughout the pandemic, many of those folks moved on to other things, and not having access to skilled labor is definitely a concern. However, overall, in terms of the capacity for the short term, 67% of suppliers to medium events are fully or moderately prepared to supply or provide services even as we go into the summer and fall of 2020. 64% of those suppliers to large events are fully or moderately prepared to supply or provide services. So most have become very adept at handling the ups and downs of the pandemic, and do have a lot of confidence that they are going to be able to be ready to meet the demand. And as far as longer term out, so again, we talked about some of the sort of trailing impacts of the pandemic, such as loss of staff, the impact of the loss of revenue on the ability to upkeep equipment, things like that. So those are the things that could have a more long-term impact. But we found that 61% of suppliers, again, in the medium event supplier range, are very optimistic about their ability to provide services even out 1 or 2 years. 7 of 14 for the large events are, again, fully or moderately prepared, looking at a longer outlook, and 62% were somewhat or very optimistic about the future when we just talked generally about what the outlook was. So all of these things kind of feed in a little bit to supply chain resiliency, but what we really looked at when we talked about supply chain resiliency is what all of those factors together really did in terms of what the current state of the industry is now. So temporary closures were very significant, but very few businesses in the event supply chain were permanently shuttered as a result of the pandemic. So most of the businesses that we surveyed and that we spoke to were able to make it through. We found that about 17% indicated that they were previous suppliers, so indicated that they either had closed their business or moved operations outside of Atlantic Canada. But despite this, those that we interviewed that were in that place, only 5% indicated that their business closure was permanent. So 80% that they were planning to reopen in the future. And we did have about 15% that were unsure. So things are still, as you know, changing. So there's still 15% that are kind of in a wait and see place that don't intend to permanently close, but aren't quite sure. So we took all of these components and sort of assigned a low, moderate, or high risk to them in terms of what needs immediate attention or is a high concern, and what is sort of a moderate concern of the supply chain, and how these things are most likely to impact festival and events recovery moving forward. So the most significant of the things that we looked at in terms of its potential impact is really that availability of labor. That's the one that in the short term and through the rest of 2022 may have the largest impact on the health of the supply chain. The other moderate risk, the revenue losses and capacity. We did say 62%, that was a good news story, but there's still a chunk that are going to be struggling as they go through. The optimism is very high that businesses are going to be ready to meet the demand of festivals and events going through to 2022, but those are areas to be aware of. So that's a lot of information to take in at once. So we wanted to kind of pull it together a little bit and talk about what some of these things mean and what are kind of the key takeaways. I think one of the really good news stories coming out of this data is this is definitely the most optimistic run of data we've had in terms of event goers and where people are at. So most event goers in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Canada affirmed that they are planning on attending events in the summer and fall of 2020, even though there is a level of anxiety there. So even though we're still seeing case numbers, and even though things are not 100%, COVID's not gone, but people are ready to get back to events, and they're fully intending to to run with festivals and events this summer. So the industry is definitely roaring back to life. Close to a half of those attending events this summer, again, have some level of anxiety. So that is important to take into account, because I think moving forward, as festivals and events and businesses have to make decisions about whether or not they're going to carry any of the health and safety measures forward, it is important to know that there is a portion of customers out there that still have a level of concern. But I think more important is the message that that doesn't seem to be stopping them. So again, that slide that showed that there's about between 40 and 49%, depending on the market, that are still concerned. Those are all folks that are still planning on attending events. So I think we've reached a point where folks are able to assess their own risk. People are ready to get back to life and are really finally at a point where they are living with COVID, as opposed to having it prevent them from doing things for the majority of the population. But it is important to acknowledge that that anxiety still exists for a portion of the population. Full refund cancellation policies is a message that we had talked about earlier in terms of its impact, and it's certainly not gone away. Frequent sanitization are sort of the two key things that I think are the biggest takeaways in terms of impacts that people want to see. And those are things that we heard from both those that have anxiety over COVID as well as those that don't have a higher level of anxiety over COVID. So those are easy wins there. As well as the ability to buy tickets online, have assigned seating, and being able to purchase things through contactless. Those things that add value are things that people have kind of become accustomed to throughout the pandemic, and they don't want to see go away. And it is comforting to know that for those that have purchased tickets for the summer and fall events, although we don't have a ton of information around that, did feel the price was in line with what they expected to pay. People do expect prices to go up. We know from other research we've done, there is an anticipation that that increase is going to be there. So that gives us some confidence that the concerns around supplier feedback on increase of costs and having to pass those on is something that can be handled by increasing prices, because that's something that consumers are expecting. Although, again, one of the major concerns is staffing, and there are still other challenges around the supply chain as we move towards recovery, I think the overall health of the supply chain for festivals and events is in very good shape, especially in Atlantic Canada. And most suppliers are optimistic about the future and feel ready to supply medium and large events. That's not to say that there's not going to continue to be some speed bumps along the road, and that it's not going to be an easy recovery. But in terms of where we're at, we're in a fairly good place to be able to tackle the demand as we move into the rest of 2022. And overall, more than ever, people are interested in attending events. And although participants, again, paid what they were expecting for tickets, there's opportunities to enhance value, and again, to take advantage of, not take advantage, but to not feel as much of a strain in having to adapt to increased costs and things by the ability to increase ticket prices, that people will be able to handle that. And one thing that we did just through other research that we've done, an interesting finding that we've come across is, although the anxiety for COVID is there, when we talk about other concerns, it's a very small percentage of people. We're still collecting data on it, so it's still very new, but it's less than 10% of people had COVID listed as a #1 concern. People are concerned with cost of living rises, but they're also expecting costs to go up. And so that's something that events and festivals and suppliers are seeing as well, and are able to anticipate some level of understanding of consumers. And in terms of the supply chain, again, although suppliers reported lower profits, staffing concerns, overall, they're very optimistic about the future and confident that they will be able to supply events. So with that, I wanted to leave a little bit of a space, because I know it is a lot of information to digest, to have some discussion and open it up to questions.
Thanks so much, Lianne. So yeah, if you have a question, you can either just unmute yourself, or you can type something into the chat and I can relay it to Lianne. It's always the awkward part.
Well, I'd love to hear from someone if whether or not some of those insights around where the supply chain is and where consumers' minds are at is helpful in trying to navigate some of the decisions that need to be made now that mandates are lifted and you are planning for this summer and spring.
I have a question, if I could ask one, or a comment, maybe question. On the supply chain, you talked about the challenges with labor resources.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I work with the City of St. John's and Community Services, and in every area in my department, not just events, we're seeing the same challenges with labor, and we're seeing it in larger scale in the community. And I'm just wondering if that is kind of, and it sounds like it might be typical of not just a St. John's or a Newfoundland item. It's certainly outside of that. And we had a conversation this morning about it and said, you know, what is it? Is it salary increases that are going to, or, you know, hourly wage increases that are going to entice people? Is it more flexible work schedules? Is it like, what are the things that we think are going to help get our labor resource market and our recruitment for staff back up to where we need it to be? I was wondering what anybody else were having those sort of same thoughts or questions.
I can one thing that contributing to the labor challenges, and it is beyond just even the festivals and events industry, is with the move to remote work. When people did have to shift careers, there's been an opportunity to work there's a significant portion of Atlantic Canadians who are working for companies that are not necessarily based in Atlantic Canada. And so those individuals that might have been able to slide back into those jobs when those jobs started reappearing have found other work outside of the province. And so in terms of enticing people back, that's a really interesting question, and one that we're actually, I think a lot of businesses are tackling, in terms of whether or not people want to see a more attractive work environment so they can get back to interacting with individuals, and that's the appeal, or whether or not, as you say, the pandemic has increased the appetite for more flexible working schedules and more work from home, especially with things like the increase in gas. So that's something that we're looking into now, not just in this series and others, but I don't think it's one that we have a good handle on what the answer is just yet.
I'd be interested to learn more, because I see some comments popping up that it's not just a remuneration issue, and it is, you know, the ability to work remotely, and we're seeing it whether it be like a summer seasonal position, or a, you know, an event-based position, or a part-time, or even into full-time. We're seeing it all, and I'm keen to see if there's been any research to see what's going to get the workforce back in place, and a lot of movement, people just hopping from job to job to job too, right? So how we can get some back to some settle now that we know we're going to reopen, and the demand is going to grow on us again to get our programs and services back up and going. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Anastasia has a question, says, curious whether suppliers noted whether they were getting an increase in calls from event organizers for their services.
We spoke with most of the suppliers in the fall, and at that point they were already planning out. So we did certainly speak to people that were starting to see things pick back up, but we didn't have anyone note in particular that things were increased beyond what they would have seen prior to the pandemic at that point.
I can make a comment on that if you don't mind. It's Pete Quinn, St. John's, Newfoundland. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Just from the festival we're doing a few this summer, George Street and Churchill Park Music Fest. And in calling around to people like Stage Line for a stage, or production quotes and tour tech, solo tech, wherever, this is the busiest year they've had in 20 years. It's twice as busy as a normal year. So if that's any indication of, you know, what festival organizers want to do, are trying to accomplish, you know, whether the ticket goers are there or not, it's certainly the busiest season in a long, long time, and very difficult to get the equipment you want. I just bought a stage because I couldn't rent one, for example. So that's my only comment to that in regards to since the fall, when you did your research, what you just mentioned. Yeah, and I've only had these calls in the last 2 weeks. It's really busy out there. Thank you.
Fantastic. There's Rick Allred on here says, I'm a small supplier, but yes, it's crazy. Fantastic. I think there was a Kent, Kent had its hand raised, but I don't know. It went away.
Yeah,
There we go.
couple questions and comments. I enjoyed the presentation. Thanks for doing it. I think it's very important for festivals and events in their planning to know what the consumer confidence going ahead is and going to be when we're trying to price our events. But a couple things I'm wondering is, what was the sample size? Like, how many people was in your research? And also, are the other festivals and events, I know in ours, you would think with entertainers not working for 2 years or roughly 2 years, that the demand for them would have been less, so they might have been in around the same prices of what they were, but we're finding big increases coming out of the pandemic in cost of entertainment and such.
So I guess I'll go back to the first piece on the consumer. So the sample size for this was 600. It is a lower sample size than what we would typically do for this broad of a market, but we do have a lot of confidence in the results, and that we're doing a lot of smaller work in particular provinces and seeing very, very similar results in terms of folks, both intention to get back to doing things in public, in their support for the removal of restrictions. Again, there's a portion that are, and it tends to be in sort of the 25% range, that aren't, and many of those may have higher risk levels, but for the most part, we're seeing very consistent results in terms of folks' desire to get back to traveling, to get back to festivals and events, to get back to kind of life as normal. And on the second piece around cost increase, I mean, that's something that we noted as a moderate level of concern for suppliers going forward. We do think that there is some, again, the fact that folks are expecting higher costs gives you a little bit of flexibility to be able to provide that. That also feeds into people's general level of concern. So I mentioned we're currently running a study right now that's showing that the pandemic is pretty low on the priority list in terms of where people's heads are at, but cost of living increases is quite significant. And people are expecting that across the board, which will allow you to push that back through, but and recover some of those additional costs that come around from entertainers and supplies increasing. But that's something we're seeing across the board in terms of increases.
Yeah. So is there any, did you say 5,600? And is there any breakdown on age? Like, is it the older population that is more weary of getting back out to events where the younger ones are ready to roll, or is there any demographics broke down like that?
So it was 600, I want to clarify. So we don't have a lot of confidence in our specific breakdowns, but again, through some of the other research that we've done, this particular sample actually skewed young rather. And I think that in part is because we asked people whether or not they were intending to attend events in the future. And we do see that a lot of the older population who have higher risks or potential comorbidities, there is still a higher level of concern among those older folks, and more caution in terms of getting it to go to events. Now, in terms of what the general population of event and festival goers looks like, the sample that we have here reflects that, in that there is a slight skew towards younger in terms of those folks, the percentage of people that go out and do festivals and events. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There is still a higher percentage of concern among the older population. But I do think it's important to note in that the higher level of concern doesn't necessarily reflect in a significant difference in terms of intention. So for those people who are still planning to go to events, we're seeing the same pattern in that folks, there's still that percentage of people that are concerned that might be higher. They're anxious, but they're still willing to go.
Perfect, thanks. There's some great chats or comments in the chats about the same thing, how it's, you know, the 55 plus is a little bit more timid to go. And Kim kindly mentioned that, I don't want to lie, so I'm just going to scroll up, that the detailed table will be in the full report. And that will be available. Again, Kim kindly responded earlier to somebody else. So the presentation and the full reports will be available through the TIAs. The full report is currently offered translation at the moment, so you'll be able to get that from them when it's available.
There's some great information in the full report that looks at or the conversations and interviews we had in the subsectors of suppliers and how some of this information may differ, especially in terms of the health of the supply chain for industry to industry. Overall, it's a similar message, but there are certainly some nuances that will be worth checking out.
Excellent. Is there any other questions? There's nothing in the chat, further questions, but if anybody else has anything. So much fantastic information. You have to like process it all, and I'm sure everybody will have some questions after, which you can absolutely reach out to and ask them, and we'll connect you and get those answers for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat with anyone if there's any questions that come up down the road.
Excellent. Lots of thank you. So I'm assuming that there's no more questions, but again, if you do, just reach out and we will connect you with Lianne and we'll get those sorted out, get those answers for you. And I was supposed to mention this at the beginning, and of course I forgot, but this is being recorded. So if you have somebody on your team that wasn't able to join us, it will be available to view later on. Perfect. Thanks so much, everybody, and thanks so much, Lianne, for taking the time to present this for us. It's a very positive future for us, I think.
Not with our challenges, but it's a good outlook.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome.
Thank
Thank you all. Take care.